At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, a young army guard was standing alone outside a steel door in New Mexico. He had a rifle, a splitting headache, a blister on his heel, and absolutely no idea that something dying on the other side of that door was about to enter his mind. There was no voice, no footsteps, no words. Instead, he felt something pressing against the inside of his skull, and then, somehow, he understood it. The being had only days left to live, and what it showed him wasn't a warning about humanity. It wasn't a message about where it came from. It wasn't even a plea for help. It showed him something that would eventually disappear from every record, something that, according to the story, someone had deliberately erased. And if even a fraction of this account is true, the most disturbing part of Roswell may not be what crashed in 1947. It may be what was removed afterward. So stay with me, because the final message is stranger than the crash itself. And before we enter that corridor, subscribe if you want more stories about unexplained encounters, classified mysteries, and the darkest corners of UFO history. Now, go back to 1947. Summer, Roswell, New Mexico. Something had fallen from the sky. For decades, people have argued about what happened next. Some say it was a military balloon. Some say it was part of Project Mogul. Others believe the debris belonged to something that wasn't made on Earth. But hidden inside one particular account is a completely different story. A story about a living being, a being supposedly recovered after the crash, a being described by witnesses as small, grey, and unmistakably non-human. And according to the account, it didn't die immediately. It survived for approximately 11 days. 11 days inside a military facility. 11 days surrounded by people who supposedly didn't know what they were looking at. And during those 11 days, one guard claims something happened that was never supposed to leave the building. His name was Harold Creech, and whenever Creech told the story, he apparently didn't begin with the crash. He began with a door, a plain steel door, painted grey. No number, no name, no warning, no sign, just a door at the end of a corridor. According to Creech, the corridor belonged to what he described as a supplementary medical area, somewhere in or near Walker Air Force Base. His job was simple: stand outside, guard the door, don't ask questions. For 7 nights. That's exactly what he did. Nothing happened. No strange sounds. No conversation. No emergency. Just the quiet hum of machinery somewhere behind the wall. Night after night. Same corridor. Same door. Same silence. Until the 8th night, something changed. Creech later described the first thing he noticed as the disappearance of a sound. Not an explosion. Not a scream. The opposite. Silence. The machinery behind the door had stopped. And suddenly the corridor felt different. Then he felt something behind his eyes. At first he thought it was pressure, like the strange sensation right before a sneeze. Except it didn't go away. It became stronger, stronger, and stronger, until he became violently nauseous. He reportedly had to put his shoulder against the grey door, just to keep himself upright. And then something happened that he struggled to explain for the rest of his life. He didn't hear a voice. He didn't see a face. He didn't hear language. Instead, he received something. Creech described it almost like receiving a telegram inside his own skull, an outside intelligence, using his mind as the receiver. And here's what makes the story so disturbing. He wasn't thinking about aliens. He wasn't thinking about the military. He wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about something incredibly ordinary, a blister. His left boot had been rubbing against his heel for 2 days. That's what was occupying his mind when the sensation began. A blister on his foot. A water stain on the ceiling, the smell of industrial chemicals, tiny, meaningless details. And then suddenly, something from the other side of the door seemed to reach toward him, not physically, mentally. Creech later described what followed as 3 separate impressions, not sentences, not conversations, 3 ideas that appeared inside his mind with a clarity he couldn't explain. The first was a location. He somehow perceived a place underground, but there was something wrong with the description, because according to Creech, the place wasn't underground here. That's how he described it. A place beneath something, but not beneath the Earth. He couldn't explain what that meant. Was it another planet? Another dimension? Another place entirely? Or was his brain simply trying to translate something it had never encountered before into concepts it already understood? Creech apparently didn't know, and neither do we. But the second impression was even worse, because it wasn't a location. It was an emotion, a massive wave of grief. Not fear, not anger, not hatred. Grief, but not grief for itself. grief for humanity. Creech described the sensation as though whatever was behind that door was looking at him, looking at this young soldier, his uniform, his weapon, his wounded heel, his ordinary human life, and somehow, it felt sorry for him, it mourned us. Think about that for a moment. If this account were true, the dying being wasn't using its final moments to tell humanity where it came from. It wasn't begging for rescue, it wasn't threatening us, it was grieving for us. And the question becomes terrifyingly simple. Why? What could a non-human intelligence possibly know about humanity that would make it feel sorrow for us? What had it seen? What did it understand about our future? Or perhaps, what had it already witnessed? Then came the third message, and this one was different. Creech described it as a feeling of finality, but not the ordinary finality of death. Something else, something being erased, not destroyed, erased. Imagine a document being deleted. Then imagine someone going further, burning the paper, destroying the copies, wiping the computers, removing the references, making sure nobody could ever reconstruct what had been there. That was apparently the sensation Creech received. Intentional erasure. Someone, or something, was deliberately removing something from existence. But what? The being itself, its spacecraft, a piece of information, a discovery, a memory? Creech never claimed to know, but one word apparently stayed with him. Intentional. He reportedly used that word repeatedly when describing the experience years later. Whatever was happening, it wasn't accidental. Something was being removed, and someone wanted it gone. According to the story, the being had been alive for approximately 11 days. 11 days in a room behind that grey door, and Creech wasn't supposedly the only person who noticed something unusual. Other individuals were said to have encountered the same patient. A physician, a communications technician, an administrative worker, and a civilian specialist whose exact position was never clearly identified. Different people, different jobs, but according to the story, similar experiences. And that is where things become much darker, because one of the alleged witnesses supposedly kept a journal. 11 pages, not hundreds, not a massive confession, just 11 handwritten pages. The journal reportedly belonged to a communications technician who had worked inside the facility. He supposedly described the being as the patient, and he wrote about something that sounds almost impossible. He believed the patient wasn't communicating, only when someone stood nearby. He believed it was transmitting constantly, like a radio station, always broadcasting. The problem wasn't that the signal wasn't there. The problem was that most people didn't have the ability to receive it. But occasionally, at certain hours, the signal supposedly became stronger, and when it did, he saw what he called flashes of architecture, not buildings, not rooms, architecture in the deepest possible sense, patterns, structures, the underlying framework of something too enormous for the human mind to see all at once. And then came the sentence that allegedly stayed with the researcher who later heard about the journal. The technician supposedly wrote, "They don't know something we don't. They remember something we've been made to forget. Something we've been made to forget." Now, imagine the implications. One dying being, one military facility, multiple people, different experiences, and a recurring idea, erasure. But the official Roswell story says something very different. According to the official explanation, the material recovered near Roswell was connected to a high-altitude balloon program, Project Mogul, rubber, foil, balsa wood, equipment, no extraterrestrial bodies, no surviving beings, no secret medical room, no grey door, no dying patient. That's the official explanation. But stories surrounding Roswell have always survived beyond the official explanation. And within this particular account is an alleged document that supposedly raises an uncomfortable question, a memorandum dated years after the crash. The document allegedly discussed biological containment, and buried inside it was a phrase concerning the condition of a subject. The communication attempts had supposedly produced inconclusive results, but unusual methods of communication had not been ruled out. Read that again. Unusual methods of communication. If there was no living subject, why would anyone be discussing communication with one? If there was no biological material, why would containment procedures exist? And if there was nothing to communicate with, why would communication attempts have failed? Of course, a phrase on paper doesn't automatically prove what people want it to prove, but that's exactly what makes the mystery so persistent. The fragments never quite fit together. Creech claimed the experience lasted approximately 4 minutes, only 4, but he described those 4 minutes as something that seemed both incredibly short and impossibly long. He checked his watch afterward, then checked it again when another guard passed through the corridor. 4 minutes, that's all. 4 minutes of contact, and somehow, 3 impressions had been transmitted: a place, grief, and erasure. But Creech kept the story to himself, for decades, not 1 year, not 5, not 10, 43 years. 43 years without telling the world. And perhaps that's the strongest argument against the story, because memory changes. People reinterpret experiences. Trauma can alter recollection. A strange event can become something much larger after decades of thinking about it. That's the skeptic's argument, and it's a fair one. But then another problem appears. Creech supposedly wasn't the only person who remained silent. According to the account, researcher Diane Fortescue documented several people who supposedly had access to the same facility around the same period. One was a doctor, another was a communications technician, another was an administrative worker, and another was a civilian contractor. Their stories supposedly emerged decades later. One physician allegedly spoke about the experience in the early 1980s. The communications technician never publicly came forward. Instead, according to the account, his widow discovered a handwritten journal after his death. 11 pages. She reportedly allowed the researcher to read it years later, but she wouldn't allow photographs, she wouldn't allow copies, and she wouldn't allow the pages to leave the room. The researcher read them, and left. After that, the journal supposedly disappeared. And if that sounds like the perfect ending for a conspiracy story, that's exactly why it becomes so difficult to separate evidence from legend. Because the most important pieces are always the ones nobody can independently examine: the missing journal, the unidentified facility, the alleged documents, the witnesses who waited decades, the records that supposedly don't exist. But then comes another detail. Years later, a man named Vernon Quest allegedly told the researcher about something he had encountered during a long career working around defense contractors. He wasn't presenting himself as a whistleblower. He didn't claim to have seen an alien. Instead, he claimed he had seen files 3 times, different locations, different organizations, different years. But the files supposedly shared something unusual, a classification marking that he claimed didn't appear in the standard classification manuals he had seen. And according to his account, the documents all had something else in common: their origin dates, July through October of 1947, the same period surrounding Roswell. But the strangest detail wasn't the dates, it was the content field. Normally, a classified document still has some kind of subject description, something identifying what the file concerns, but according to Quest, these files didn't. The field hadn't simply been left empty, it had allegedly been replaced with zeros, again and again and again, everywhere. 0, 0, 0. As if whatever information had once existed, there had not merely been classified, but deliberately removed, and suddenly that word returns. The same word Creech supposedly used decades earlier. Intentional. But let's step away from aliens for a moment. Forget Roswell. Forget UFOs. Forget secret military bases. Imagine that you discovered an archive containing thousands of historical documents, and every document connected to one particular event had its central information removed, not blacked out, not marked classified, just gone. What would you assume? That the information was insignificant, or that someone had decided nobody should ever know it existed? And that's the question that begins to haunt this story. Not who crashed at Roswell, not where did the spacecraft come from, but something much simpler: what was lost? Because if the being really transmitted something during those 11 days, then what did humanity fail to hear? According to Creech's account, the being died around July 18th. The next time he reported for duty, the grey door was gone, not opened, gone. The hinges had apparently been removed. The frame was exposed. Inside was an empty room, freshly painted, clean, a single light overhead. No equipment, no machinery, no residue, no evidence that anything had ever been there. It was as though the room had been reset, not cleaned, reset. Every trace removed. Creech stood there, and according to his story, the pressure behind his eyes was still there, only faintly, like the echo of a sound after the source has disappeared. And then he did something he'd never done before. He tried to communicate back. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know whether the being could still hear him. He didn't even know what he wanted to say. But he stood inside that empty room, and tried, for the first time, And according to him, the last time. Then he returned to his post, and kept silent. For another 43 years. Maybe nothing. Maybe the entire story grew from a misunderstanding. Maybe a frightened young guard experienced something he couldn't explain and spent decades trying to understand it. Maybe memories changed. Maybe stories became legends. Maybe documents were misinterpreted. Or maybe something really did happen behind that grey door. Something that never entered the official history books. Because if the story is true, then a dying intelligence may have spent its final hours trying to communicate with us. And the message wasn't, "We are coming." It wasn't, "We will return." It wasn't even, "Help me." It was something far more disturbing. A place that wasn't underground, at least not here. A wave of grief directed toward humanity. And finally, the sensation that something important had been deliberately erased. 3 impressions, 11 days, 1 dying being, multiple alleged witnesses, a missing journal, unexplained files, and a word that keeps appearing again and again, intentional. But here's the question I can't get out of my head. If this being knew it was dying, why communicate at all? Why choose a young soldier standing alone in a corridor? Why transmit grief? Why show him something that couldn't be explained? And most importantly, what did it know about us that made it mourn? Because perhaps the most terrifying possibility isn't that something came to Earth in 1947. Perhaps it's that something came here, looked at humanity, and became afraid of what would happen next. And perhaps whatever it tried to warn us about wasn't destroyed. It was simply erased. And somewhere in the darkness between what we remember and what we've been made to forget, the message may still be waiting. If you want me to keep digging into stories like this, subscribe. Because sometimes, the most frightening secrets aren't the ones hidden from us. They're the ones we were never supposed to remember.